It was all friendly after the fight. Like, we were in his locker room, we were all talking and stuff. And then someone in the camp received the IV text message. And then things took a totally different turn.
That came that night. Oh, wow.
We learned that.
Alhamdulillah. I know you got this, they don't like this. Alhamdulillah. Tomorrow night, I'm gonna smash your boy, guys.
This is #1 bullshit.
Volkanovski's team have now admitted that they actually don't know if Islam Makhachev or anyone else used an IV at UFC 284. In this video, we're going to discuss this new information, review all the facts, and expose the lies regarding the IV controversy. Let's jump into it. This all started 2 days after UFC 284, when Dan Hooker accused Islam of cheating by hiring a nurse to illegally administer an IV in a series of tweets. Accusations from Volk came out later that same day.
Yeah, 178 to 180, I think he would have been. I've heard he gets up to 180, like 83 kilograms close to, so could be, Yeah, you fill up pretty quick, on the IVs and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay.
One piece of evidence people immediately started pointing to are pictures of Islam during fight week with what looks like a bruise on his arm as evidence backing up the claims that Islam used an IV. The head of USADA for UFC, Jeff Nowitzki, actually debunked this theory.
And so where did it come from? It came from there was a bruise on his arm?
Yeah,
I think
there was some photos floating around.
Yeah.
What I don't think a lot of people realize, especially the Australian athletes, because they weren't subject to this, but all non-Australian athletes that week gave a blood draw on Wednesday as part of their pre-fight physical. And I think if you look, at pictures thereafter, you saw a small Band-Aid, on the arm. And then as that day progressed, Wednesday and Thursday, the bruising grew from that exact same spot.
I would imagine too, if a fighter's cutting weight, more likely to bruise maybe for something like that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you mentioned cutting weight. And the idea of a Wednesday or a Thursday, a fight week, of getting an IV is contrary to everything these fighters are trying to do.
Yeah.
You're dropping sodium, that last day or two in order to drop that water in a bag of, saline, is probably going to put you in a position where you're unable to cut that water weight. It's not the time you'd be using an IV.
Over the next several months after the initial accusations, multiple members of Volk's team did media continuing to accuse Islam. These stories contradicted each other though. Here's just a few examples. On February 19th, Dan said the team found out after the fight and the nurse administered an IV for Islam.
You get a local nurse who contacts our team after the fight and says, yeah, hey, I just gave a IV to Islam Makhachev. It's like...
Just 1 week later, Volk's head coach Joe Lopez told Daily Mail Australia that their team, with the exception of Volk, found out before the fight. Quote, I heard about the IV stuff before the fight. We didn't say anything to Alex. We kept that to ourselves. We knew about it then, end quote. Joe stated the nurse dropped off IVs to a hotel room, but she did not administer any IVs. Quote, she rang her boss and her boss said, just leave the bags and get out of there. And that's what they've done, end quote. And Joe admitted that the information they have about the IV controversy is hearsay. Quote, what we do know, and it's hearsay, is that there was an IV company that they approached and got to the hotel room, end quote. The biggest issue with Joe's account here is that he had already done an interview before this one where he said that they have evidence. His story about what the nurse told them is pretty much the same, but to go from saying you have solid evidence to then saying what you know is hearsay is a problem.
Especially for the future, if not now, for the future. Because I'd love to have, Islam fight Alex again, but on a level playing field, And again, we were, I guess, like Dan put it, you can't expect to come to our country and not expect it to get back to us that you went out and tried to get IVs, because that is, they did get IVs. That is, they can't deny that. Who took it, how they took it, what they put in it, who knows? But we know that for a fact. We've got that evidence. And a lot of guys are writing.
On April 6th, Volk's grappling coach Craig Jones said a nurse went to a rich Russian guy's house during fight week, administered IVs to friends of the camp, and dropped off IV bags. He also said the team found out after the fight.
It was all friendly after the fight. Like, we were in his locker room, we were all talking and stuff. And then someone in the camp received the IV text message. And then things took a totally different turn.
That came that night. Oh, wow.
We learned that straight afterwards, because I believe the story was someone used the IV company. A friend of the camp had used it, and she told a very weird story about how fight week, she showed up to a random, like, rich Russian guy's house, and there was these very weird circumstances where the guy in question only wanted half-filled IV bags. He wanted to put his own things in the IV bag, which Australia's pretty, like, their medical regulations and stuff, like, you can't get away with much down there. So I believe throughout the whole interaction, she kept calling her boss, being like, this is very unusual, are we allowed to do this? And they were going back and forth, and I believe ultimately she just, like, she did the task and then left a couple of IV bags and left. So I believe that's actually known as she didn't want to.
The fact that there are clear discrepancies between these stories is evidence that Volk's team has definitely not been accurate and has possibly been dishonest with their reports. Last week, on June 12th, Volk's manager admitted that they have no evidence that Islam used an IV at UFC 284. He changes his story 3 times, though. First, he says they were given information from the company that gave Islam an IV. Note that this is a bit different than the previous story that an individual nurse reached out. Then he says they know that this IV was administered, they just don't know who got it. And then he says they don't even have enough information to know what athlete, if any at all, used an IV.
I mean, I'll touch on it. Like we were given information from the company that did it. So, you know, and whether, but I will go out and say this, that I don't know who did it. I'm not going to sit here and say that, but like what we were given is information that happened, but I don't know who did it.
Meaning who took the IV?
What athlete, or if any at all. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So like, and that's it. So obviously, that's it. Like, and so whether it did or it didn't, like where there's smoke, there's fire, and it's just fucking burning. Sorry for swearing.
No.
Despite Volk's manager admitting they don't know, quote, what athlete, if any at all, received an IV, here's what Dan Hooker had to say on June 29th.
You know what I mean? I couldn't actually, I don't invest any kind of energy into it. Look, I said what I said, I back what I said. It's beating a dead horse at this point. The powers that be, don't want to do anything about it. So I feel like it's just beating a dead horse at this point, but I can't honestly say that my stance has really changed much. So
I respect that. You come out, say what you feel. I respect it. You need more of that in this sport, I reckon. And his manager come out and said that he took an IV, and then like 24 hours later, he's acting like he never said it.
That's like, it's cool. Bank robbing is not illegal, and then it's illegal, and then go, he didn't rob the bank. It's like, well,
he needed Conor McGregor's PR manager when Conor goes out and tweets, and then he wakes up and deletes them all. That's what this bloke did. He tweeted and then panicked, I reckon. Oh, it is what it is. I feel like everyone can read between the lines and really read the situation, but beating a dead horse at this point. That's the way I look at it.
And speaking about
even though this team already admitted there's no evidence that Islam used an IV, Dan insists that Islam is guilty, and we should all just believe that he's guilty. Who needs evidence when you can just read between the lines? Dan went on MMA Hour on July 5th and said Islam used an IV, quote, in my opinion. Again, who needs evidence when you have Dan's opinion?
Okay, so you believe that some funny business went down. You still believe that? Nothing has happened.
100%. In my opinion, it was Islam Makhachev that took the IV. Like, that's like my opinion.
Dan said that this could have been a, quote, misunderstanding about the IV rule, which we'll talk about later. But despite not having evidence, Dan has no regrets about accusing Islam of cheating.
I can't say that. Like, if I hadn't said what I said, would anyone know that had transpired? Like,
probably not.
Besides, like, dropping subliminal messages on the Helwani show, I don't think anyone would have known that would have gone down. So, do I regret saying that? There's no way. That's if you're facing my team, if you're competing against my team, and you're doing anything untoward, and I find out about it, I'm gonna put you on blast. Like, that's not.
Know that what transpired exactly. Even their team now admits that they don't know, quote, what athlete, if any at all, received an IV. And Dan also had the nerve to compare this situation to O.J. Simpson. If you don't know who O.J. Simpson is, he was charged with murdering his ex-wife and her friend, but was found not guilty in what was a very controversial verdict.
Maybe it didn't have like the evidence to get it over the line. You know what I mean? But that doesn't, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's O.J. Simpson's walking around. You know what I mean? Would you invite him to your family? Would you invite him to your family barbecue? Probably not.
It's been over 4 months since the fight, and Dan continues to spread misinformation and slander Islam when there's no evidence that anyone received an IV. It's ridiculous. I do believe they didn't make this whole thing up out of thin air. I think they did hear a rumor or had someone reach out to them with a story about delivering IV bags. I think Joe Lopez's story is probably the closest to the truth about what information they have, and it's pretty consistent with what Volk's manager ultimately ended up saying. However, they very clearly took something unsubstantiated and vague and ran with it in a very irresponsible way because they were upset about the loss and wanted to discredit Islam's win. To immediately stretch what we now know as the truth into very loud and public accusations that Islam is 100% guilty of using an IV is reprehensible. Islam wasn't even the only person from his team who fought on this card, but the immediate accusations from Dan and even Volk were about Islam being guilty. And instead of apologizing for damaging Islam's reputation without evidence, they dug their heels in and tried to do as much damage as possible by continuing to slander him in the media for months. This team spent a lot of time preaching about the importance of rules and fairness and that this is why they made such a big deal about the situation, but that's not true either. First of all, using IVs is actually allowed by UFC and USADA. The IV policy has been in place since 2019, and it states that fighters are allowed to be given IVs of more than 100 milliliters as long as it's done by a medical provider. Joe Lopez actually said in one of his interviews that he's been told by people in the UFC that, quote, 90% of the UFC roster uses IVs, end quote. In response to the accusations, the UFC redistributed its IV policy on February 15th. The UFC actually sent out emails about the policy to make sure the fighters and the public were made aware that IVs are actually allowed because Volk's team incorrectly said using an IV was cheating. Media members and Jeff Nowitzki tweeted about the IV policy. On this same day, shortly after all of these tweets, Ali tweeted and then deleted the following. For all those idiots out there, any fighter under the UFC banner can take 2 to 3 liters of IV as long as it's done by a nurse or a professional. Next week, I'm going to expose everybody. Islam Makhachev is the pound for pound king. People have been saying this is proof Islam is guilty, but they don't understand or maybe are just ignoring the context. He doesn't say Islam used an IV. He's restating the rule that had just been released in the media. We all know how Ali can be. He could not help but shove it in this team's face that they were accusing Islam of something that isn't even banned. Ali should not have tweeted this though. It's in bad taste, which is probably why he deleted it, but it's certainly not an admission of guilt. One of the reasons why people thought this was a big deal is because Ariel Helwani tweeted out misinformation about the IV rule. He incorrectly called Ali's tweet incriminating, which fueled the narrative that Islam is guilty. Ariel is actually wrong. Again, there is no limit on the USADA policy, so in fact, 2 to 3 liters wouldn't be in violation of USADA rules. Ariel's producer actually educated him about the rule, so we know he was made aware of what the rule actually says.
Some confusion around what those rules were kind of saying, which is that over the course of 12 hours, you can take 100 milliliters of fluid. But I don't think that that is, and somebody who knows this better than me can correct me, I think that that's only, you don't need that to be administered by a professional. You can go above that 100 milliliter. Okay. You can go above that limit and take more if it is administered by a professional. Those are two separate instances of where you are allowed to take an IV, which is 100 milliliters, cool, over the course of 12 hours. If above that, deemed medically necessary and administered by a professional, that can be done as well and is legal. But to your point, this is all confusing. And
as a journalist, Ariel is ethically obligated to disseminate accurate information. It's understandable that he was confused initially about this rule, but he never issued a correction or admitted he made a mistake to clear up the confusion about Islam being guilty that he caused with his tweet. Ariel also didn't tweet about many of the important developments, including the official statements from USADA and the commission that there was no evidence. Unfortunately, Ariel has a history of this kind of bias against certain fighters, and he's not the only one. The MMA media in general is often biased. Just think about this particular case. How much media coverage was there about the accusations, most of which painted Islam as guilty? It was all over the place. And now, how much coverage have you seen now that they admitted there's no evidence? I haven't seen one single media source report on it. Our team even reached out to several media organizations and YouTube content creators with the information we're presenting to you now, and the only person who said they were planning to discuss it was MMA Joey. When discussing the IV controversy, a lot of fans will say it doesn't matter that IVs are legal per USADA because they are illegal in Australia. And they're partially correct. The Western Australia Combat Sports Commission does ban IVs, but they also ban all weight-cutting measures. Here's the rule. In the interest of contestant safety, the commission prohibits the use of heat suits, saunas, and any other device which purposely increases body temperature and or dehydrates the contestant. Every fighter who cut weight used something to increase their body temperature or dehydrate them. Since almost all fighters cut weight, every UFC 284 fighter is probably guilty of breaking the commission rules. In fact, here's evidence Volkanovski broke the commission rule.
Closer to the weigh-in, so I'm going to do that tomorrow morning. He's already dehydrated now.
So you're not cutting weight at all tonight? Just okay. Right,
tonight, I might have a small hot bath by myself, just maybe a light sweat, go to bed at a weight that we wake up and only have to do a very small cut in the morning. So we can have a good sleep, healthy sleep, get good rest, and then wake up and then get that weight off and only be dehydrated, or a little bit dehydrated, for a short amount of time. He's already dehydrated.
Now let's say Islam had used an IV. If the commission enforced their rules, then all fighters are in violation, Volk included. But Volk's team wanted Islam to be the only one targeted and punished. They wanted to selectively choose which rules are important and enforced. It's okay for Volk to break the rules, but if Islam does it, he's a cheater. If Islam had used an IV, it would have been because it's legal, just not in Australia, and he didn't know. Just like every fighter cut weight because it's legal, just not in Australia. To call it cheating is just a really deceptive and hypocritical thing to do. Clearly, this team isn't interested in justice or fairness. They're literally just trying to get Islam into trouble. In an interview in March, Dan said he knows at this point that IVs are legal per USADA and UFC, but insists that he has proof Islam was administered an IV, and says his goal is to discredit Islam and to catch him lying. Notice how happy he is at the idea of making Islam look bad.
How do I discredit something he hasn't denied? He comes out and denies it, I'll discredit him. That's a fact. If you know what I mean. I said I had receipts. I have actual receipt. there's having receipts, that's a term of phrase, and then there's having the actual receipt that he paid for getting the IV.
Islam, of course, did deny using an IV multiple times, even before Dan's interview, but Dan never came out with the proof he talked about.
Я не могу поставить капельницу, потому что это запрещено, и я не прибегаю к этим вещам. 100% я хотел бы своим примером лично показать всем нашим ребятам, потому что у нас залы в республике переполнены, чтобы я был для них правильным примером, что любой парень из простой семьи может прийти в зал, тренироваться каждый день, поставить перед собой цель и просто идти каждый день к этому. И обязательно человек, который поставил цель и трудится, он добьется своего рано или поздно.
All the stories from this team are different, but Dan is the only person who explicitly maintained that Islam was administered an IV. From Volk's manager's recent admission, we now know that they falsely accused Islam, and it was a lie to say that Islam was administered an IV and that they have proof of that. Also, Australia is governed by strict privacy law that restricts the release of any personal health information. If a nurse did disclose someone's private health information to Volk's team, that is completely illegal. I myself work as a healthcare provider in America. We have similarly strict laws regarding patient privacy. As soon as I heard this story about a nurse telling people about a medical procedure, and then hearing that this person gave out medical paperwork, I thought that was highly suspect. No legitimate, i.e. trustworthy or ethical, provider would violate the right to privacy as governed by law. Surely Volk's team, who cares so much about rules, must care about the law being broken. Did they report this nurse and the company she works for to the Australian government? Of course not. In fact, Dan suggests in this interview that he was doing his own digging, which would be attempting to violate Islam's legal right to privacy by eliciting additional private, legally protected information in order to broadcast that information to the public.
Like it's my responsibility to investigate this. Am I a journalist? You know what I mean? Dan also said during this interview, USADA was punishing him for the accusations against Islam by more frequently testing him. Well, USADA actually responded saying that Dan was lying about that and provided proof. Quote, "We are sorry Dan feels this way, but it is absolutely not the case. He's only been tested once this year as reflected on our website." On February 17th, the Combat Sports Commission of Western Australia said there's no evidence of IV use and that no one had even submitted a complaint. Jeff Nowitzki echoed that there was no evidence. Volk's team did end up filing a formal complaint at some point after that to try to get Islam in trouble.
My team doesn't have to, prove it, to name them. No, we don't. That's not how this works. That's not how this works. There's proper authorities that take care of this. You just don't go on the internet and start, like, you know, telling every little detail about an investigation that's going on. Like, that's just not how it works.
Can I ask you if they've got back to you, the investigators?
Not yet. Well, not that I know of. Like, management take care of that.
The reality is they are upset about the loss and they are making excuses for the loss. They keep saying IVs are such a huge advantage, and they even said that this is the only reason Islam won. However, here's what Volk's own dietitian, Jordan Sullivan, the guy who manages the weight cuts of Volk and everyone else from CKB, has to say about it.
So the question of whether IV is more advantageous depends on those two factors. How much weight did they cut? And do they have enough time to get that fluid back in? If it's a big drastic weight cut, then it really doesn't matter if you use IV or do it orally. You probably don't have enough time to rehydrate your cells anyway. The only advantage to using an IV is that it will restore the fluid in the blood much faster, and this can make you initially feel much better and can allow you to consume more fluids orally and consume more foods, both which will help your recovery. But over the course of the 36 hours, does it leave you more hydrated? We don't know yet, but I would tend to lean towards the answer of no, it does not.
Even Izzy, who's a teammate of Volk, was laying the foundation for the same excuse before his last fight. Izzy started making IV accusations about Alex on Twitter before weigh-ins for their fight even happened. And of course, Dan chimed in. The craziest thing about this situation is that Islam is actually the opposite of at an unfair advantage for this fight. Islam was given 12 hours less time to rehydrate than the standard amount of time. He said this significantly affected him.
Raise a good point, because if you were to fight in Las Vegas, you weigh in on Friday morning and you fight on Saturday night. In Australia, I think it was Friday night, and then you fought on, it was Saturday morning, and then you fought on Sunday morning, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't as much time. It was like 12 less hours.
Most important things, you know, for the fighter. Not just cut weight, you have to recover, but they don't give time for the recovery. I don't know, you know.
So did you weigh a lot less than you normally do on fight night?
Of course, maybe 3-4 kilo.
3-4 kilos, so that's like 8 pounds.
Because everybody say Islam's gonna be bigger than him, but I'm not bigger than him.
Islam said he was 78 kilograms or 172 pounds for the Volk fight, but usually weighs 81 kilograms or 178 and a half pounds during his fights. Comparing pictures of Islam from the Charles versus the Volk fight, you can see that Islam looked noticeably depleted. He looked smaller during the Volk fight and more filled out during the Charles fight. Here he is entering the cage. Here he is while Bruce Buffer is announcing him. And here he is celebrating after the fight. After our team found out in mid-March that Volk's team submitted an official complaint against Islam, we reached out to a very reliable source and received an update about the situation. They told us that UFC reports show that Volk was heavier than Islam by 1 to 2 pounds on fight day, and that Volk's team had not presented evidence of Islam's guilt. 2 months later, in May, Ali said the same thing, that UFC explicitly said Islam was lighter than Volk on fight day. Ali also says this team did not produce any proof.
But everybody in his team, make Alexander look bad by talking and making accusation and making this.
About the IV thing.
IV is like, prove it, because in the way, like, you shouldn't talk like that, because if you don't have proof, if you don't have nothing. And I believe, Don Hacker, I really like this guy, but now I don't know how to feel about him, because he's saying he have to prove, shoulder proof. Why are you not showing it? You know what I'm saying? But I believe maybe he's salty, Islam fought him. He almost take his arm home. I don't know what it is, or maybe you love Alexander so much, but I know if you love him so much, you honor him by saying that was the best fight ever. He's great. He went up to weight division. Don't try to point fingers. In reality, and I got this from the UFC, fight night, Alexander Volkanovski weighted 2 pounds heavier than Islam Makhachev. You're talking about IVs? He weighted 2 pounds heavier than Islam. Right. Islam didn't get no IVs in Australia.
Islam weighing less than normal and even less than Volk supports Islam's claim that not only did he not use an IV, but he was actually depleted for this fight. Now, UFC does not comment publicly on fight day weights, so it's unlikely we'll receive an official statement from them. Now, I do not think it's reasonable to expect Volk and his team to go out of their way to spread the truth about the shortened rehydration period and fight weights. However, they did the opposite and created a false narrative about the fight weights and used that misinformation to fuel the IV accusations. In his interview with Ariel after the fight, Volk said he weighed 170 pounds and Islam was 180 pounds, and linked this to IV use by saying, "You fill up pretty quick on IVs." Even if you didn't know that Islam was not 180 pounds for their fight, Volk's report here doesn't really make sense. Volk had an intense bulking regimen for almost 4 months for this fight.
How many calories did you have Volk on when you were training for 455?
We stepped it up, so we did like a step ladder approach, and it's an interesting topic. We went from about 4,000, 4,500, and we went up to 5 and tried to push a bit more. That was about his limit because it was tough on him. Like there's a real big adjustment for it, and we had to maintain that weight. Like I think we saw in the fight, like Islam super strong, but I thought Volk really held himself well. Oh. And the numbers in the gym, me and his strength conditioning coach, Chris Jaffrey, were talking about this. We've tested Volk every fight camp, every week goes in, does a standardized testing, and we've seen it happen. Like it was hard for Volk to keep that weight on with that training load and get all that volume in, but his numbers in the gym were exactly what we wanted. It was so impressive.
And Volk has previously said he weighs 168 to 170 pounds for his featherweight fights.
I know where I was going with that. Oh, where? The weight. So,
Yes,
so again,
the
I
weight.
might look smaller, but I guarantee you I'm heavier than pretty much all the featherweights, or most of them.
You're a dense
I'm
dude.
a heavy type of guy. So
Like
like
a baby rhino.
Well, yeah. So I will. We even did it with a Dan Hooker. So we fought on the same night. I think I weighed the same, or if I don't know if I was more or the same as he did when he was at
When he was
lightweight.
at 55.
So at fight day. So
Yeah,
I'll
he's
go
a
in
tall
obviously.
55.
And he's I don't know how he gets a featherweight. That's
Nuts.
just crazy.
Nuts.
But I mean, yeah. So I'll get to close to 170 or 168
Oh, shit.
or something like that. That's
You're a
fight
big
day.
dude. Oh, wow.
Fight day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're a
So
big
I'll
ass
put
dude.
on a fair bit because again, it's a lot of it's water.
I know Volk didn't want to get too bulky and lose his speed, but it doesn't make sense that he would still only weigh 170 pounds after bulking for a lightweight fight. In fact, here he is talking about all the extra weight he was carrying when he fought Islam at lightweight.
After fighting Islam at 155, was fighting back down at your weight against someone a little closer to your size, like taking a weighted vest off and then actually getting to really move?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because you could definitely feel that extra weight in 155. The sharpness wasn't there, and even though it was still there, but I mean, it just carrying that extra weight, going through camps with that extra weight, like it was. Everyone knows how hard I train. So at the end of the week, I'll be like, oh man, just absolutely cooked because of carrying that weight. So. Bringing that weight back down and being able to move, being that little bit faster and getting through camps. And obviously there's going to be nigglies.
And knowing now that Islam was around 172 pounds and Volk was slightly heavier, Volk likely weighed 173 to 174 pounds for the fight. The rest of the team perpetuated this false narrative about weights as well. Joe Lopez said, quote, "You get an IV and you're back to normal in 20 minutes, end quote. Eugene said the only reason Islam won was because of the size difference.
Both those guys probably suffered from the same fate in terms of they just weren't quite skilled enough to offset the size advantage. If you look at how both those fights panned out, and look, that's just how it is sometimes.
Volk continues to push the false narrative about Islam and weight. He's brought it up in every interview I've seen since the fight.
I don't care how big you get or whatever it is. Like you're bigger than me. That's that. You've always been bigger than me. I knew you were going to be bigger than me. That's fine. You can be bigger than me in Abu Dhabi. It ain't going to matter. You can have the people cheer.
Now, there are two really good reasons why Volk and his team continue to push these false narratives about cheating and fight weights. One, they discredit Islam's win. Volk has described his fight with Islam as a David and Goliath situation, and there's a lot of talk about how his stock has risen even though he lost because it was competitive and he was the smaller guy moving up to do the unthinkable. And two, they have implications for Volk staying pound for pound number one. Remember, this was a pound for pound number one fight. In fact, Volk was the one that put the pound for pound number one status on the line. If you think Volk lost a competitive fight with someone who is 10 pounds heavier than him, you might believe he's still the pound for pound better fighter. If you realize that he lost a competitive fight to someone who is depleted and 2 pounds lighter than him, you probably wouldn't call him the pound for pound better fighter. Perception is important, and this team has been very strategic and honestly successful with these narratives post UFC 284. In addition to the shortened rehydration period, Islam was also put through extra testing in Australia while he was cutting weight. Islam was drug tested twice before the fight and twice after the fight. For some reason, Volk wasn't subjected to the same amount of drug testing as Islam. As of April, Volk had only given 3 samples for all of 2023. Islam gave 4 in just that 1 week for this fight. In fact, at the end of February, Islam was the most tested UFC fighter in 2023 with 8 samples in 2 months. So with the commission blood draw plus 2 USADA tests, Islam was required to give samples 3 times during his weight cut, which could take a toll. These aren't the only disadvantages Islam faced. Islam flew across the world to fight in a different climate in the morning and on Volk's home turf. He had just lost Habib as part of his camp and corner, and tax rates for foreigners fighting in Australia are astronomical. He lost a lot of money in order to fight Volk in Australia. After all these sacrifices, Volk and his team had the audacity to slander Islam just because they were bitter he won. Fighters accusing other fighters of cheating isn't uncommon, but Volk's team crossed the line. Multiple people from this team did media for months calling Islam a cheater and even tried to get him into legitimate trouble for something they have no evidence actually happened. This team tried to ruin Islam's career. Even if you don't like Islam, you should not be okay with someone being falsely accused. Slandering people and trying to get them in trouble without evidence is always unacceptable and indefensible. Thanks so much for listening. Let us know your thoughts about this situation in the comments below.